than I've signed up to take of yours. Don't worry, this presentation will be well under an hour. I've timed this out. I just ran it again this morning, and I'll get you out of here in a little over 40 minutes. I am Al Paul, one of the support analysts. I probably have talked to most of you over the last few years, and I'm really happy to be here today for kind of a shorter presentation, but an important presentation, because what we're going to talk about, this business about next year's tracks, grades, and statuses, is really important because it has a lot to say about whether your kids show up where they're supposed to for next year's scheduling, and it also has a lot to say, perhaps more importantly, where they show up when you do the demographic rollover. So today we're going to concentrate just on this business about next year's tracks, grades, and statuses. And what we want to provide you with is a series of what we've tested over the last 2 years and learned to be best practices. Julie Clifford and Angie Zinnick in particular have spent a lot of time in this area. And I know a lot of you folks have worked with Angie and with Julie, and those two ladies are really bright. The organization that I'm going to bring to the steps a little later, the specific order and whatnot, really kind of began with those two ladies based on what Julie was doing, had previously done successfully as a Calgary school employee, and what Angie's been learning as she's been working with clients in SchoolLogic. Little housekeeping as always, we are going to run on mute today because the audio really does work better. Questions will be handled after the session, not during. If you do have a question, just email it to me. You see my email address up there on the screen. Bonus, as I said, bonus. I'll get you out of here in about 40, 45 minutes today. We will be recording this session today. Thankfully, I don't have a webcam, but the presentation itself and the audio will be posted on the internet. You can link to it from our community pages. You see the address up there in big white letters. This is an updated version of a presentation I did a year ago. So today's recording, probably tomorrow afternoon, will replace last year's webinar up on our website. And while we're talking about our website, community.schoollogic.com, I'm going to do an unusual thing here. I'm going to talk at the beginning about something that I want you to do at the end, like after I'm off the air. After my presentation, I want you to go to community.schoollogic.com. That's what you see here. And I want you to click on Downloads and Docs over here on the left-hand side. You see me highlight, we highlighted it over there on the left in red. This is the Downloads and Docs page. The first topic you'll see here is information about PASI in Alberta. The second thing you'll see is best practices, and that's what I'm talking about. This, obviously, is an expanded view of Downloads and Docs. Okay, I want to make sure that you know that. Whether you're running SIRS or you're running SchoolLogic, there's a document aimed at you covering what we're going to cover today. Here on the top is a SIRS document, and here's this bottom one. The names are a little different, but the bottom one, New Year Creation _SL, that's Julie's document, Julie Clifford's document, around which today's entire presentation is built. You guys and gals know, right? Around our office, when we say something is SL, that means SchoolLogic, our product, as opposed to SchoolLogic, our company. You will definitely want to download whichever one of these documents applies to you. There's good stuff in there. Which brings me to a word about SIRS and SchoolLogic. Now, everybody listening to me falls into one of three groups. You're running SchoolLogic by itself, you're running SIRS by itself, or you're running both of them in some combination, which around our offices we call you guys hybrids. Everything you see me do today is going to be done in SchoolLogic. That's the side of the house I'm the most schooled in, the most experienced with, and web-based is where this whole thing is evolving at whatever speed we get there. Now, generally, the concepts I'm going to talk about are valid whether you're running SIRS or SchoolLogic, although clearly many of the screens in the areas I'm going to show you are different between the two. If you are a hybrid school, my advice is you will want to create next year in SchoolLogic. What I mean by that is the specific step you're going to see me do live in a minute, where you go to the schedule menu, you choose next year's scheduling, and then you choose create next year. Hybrids should do that specific step in SchoolLogic, because if you create next year in SERS, SchoolLogic won't like that. Somewhere down the road, there'll be a hassle, and I will get emails and I will get phone calls. Once you have next year created and you're starting on the setup stuff that you're going to see me doing, or you're doing things like setting up the individual track dates, the school calendar, setting students up in terms of next year's tracks, grades, and statuses, if I were a hybrid school, whichever side of the house I started that work in, I'd continue my preparations there. All the steps you see me take today do actually work in both SERS and SchoolLogic. I'm just saying, if you start the steps on one side of the house, I personally would stay on the same side of the house until I had all the necessary next year tracks, grades, and statuses applied to all of my students. And remember, we're not talking today about scheduling. We're just talking about setting ourselves up for the scheduling process. Scheduling is a whole other gig, and it's beyond the point in the process that we're discussing today. For our display purposes today, you will see me use mainly SchoolLogic. I'll show you a couple of SERS screenshots in there. Just so I want you to think about a possible timetable here. This business of setting up next year's tracks, grades, and statuses, as you'll see later, we're going to suggest that you have your individual schools do this in a very specific order. And I personally would see something like this playing out over the course of a few days, maybe starting at 1 week and finishing the following week. It might take you a couple weeks, depending upon how many schools you have. Now, usually at this point in one of these webinars, I'd be giving you a little outline of what we're going to discuss today. This time around, I want to begin by telling you what we are not going to discuss. As I mentioned a minute ago, we are not going to discuss actually scheduling your students for 2015-2016. 40 minutes from now, you are not going to know exactly how to actually formulate a school schedule. We're going to touch briefly on the first part of scheduling, which is creating next year, and then we're going to spend an awful lot of time on this page, next year tracks, grades, and statuses. We have come up with some practices over the last couple years which we believe are worthy of dissemination, and I'm the guy doing the disseminating. For the record, I got to this screen that you see here on the left. On my left, it's on your main screen. I got to that screen in SchoolLogic by going to the Setup menu and choosing next year tracks, grades, and statuses. I get to the equivalent screen, which you see here in SERS, by going to the Setup menu, choosing next year, and then choosing next year tracks, grades, and statuses. The main difference between SchoolLogic and SERS versions of this particular screen is that SchoolLogic users have to assign a next year school to their students. On this form in SERS, there is not a spot for users to assign next year's school. SERS just somehow seems to put that information together on its own. In either world, we recommend that you edit these screens as school users, not as district or board users. So, where does this all start? Let me show you. Here we are in SchoolLogic, and we have logged in as an elementary principal. And I need to move a screen out of my way just to show you I have no tricks up my sleeve here. Okay, we're going to go to Setup, and we're going to go to Tracks. And I just want to show you here on the Tracks screen, as SchoolLogic takes a minute to wake up, I have 4 tracks. I'm an elementary principal. I have 4 tracks. And these are all 2014, 2015 tracks. If you're sitting close enough to the screen to see that, those are this year's tracks. Now, I said I'm going to do the very, very first step of scheduling, which is I'm going to go to the scheduling menu. I'm going to pick next year's scheduling. I'm going to get rid of student requests. That's the only box I'm going to check over here. The reason I'm going to check that box is because the requests the students currently have are the requests that got them into this year's classes. They don't need those anymore. I'm going to come down here. I'm going to say create next year. Computer says, hey, are you really sure you want to do this? I say yes. And the computer's going to go through a second, and boom, it's done. Okay. Now, two things just happened. The most visible of them for you on this screen is that we now have something called a default master board. And what the computer has done is it's created for me a blank master board that I could begin to schedule next year's stuff on if I wanted to. If I wanted to create a master board that happened to be the same as this year, I went down here on the bottom on the right, I clicked master board, and when this pop-up window, I'm going to say create from current year. And when I say create from current year, the system will create for me a master board that has the current year rooms, the current year teachers, and the current year classes already in place. So for a person who did not want to make very many changes to next year's schedule, that's really, really convenient to have. But that's not really why we're here today. We're really here today to worry about next year tracks, grades, and statuses. So I'm going to leave this, and I'm going to go back out to SchoolLogic. And I just want to point out to you before I leave, sometimes people have a little challenge remembering, are they in next year or are they in current year? How do they tell? And the real obvious thing is on the menu, if you're in next year, there's only 4 menu items. I'm going to go back out to the current year world. And now I see all the menu items I'm used to seeing. So that's your big key. Now check this out. When I go to setup and I go to tracks, remember how there used to be 4 tracks? There are now 8 tracks. And then later we had cassettes and then we had CDs. But seriously, I started with 4 tracks, and when I said create next year, the software took it upon itself to create 1 copy of each track I had out there. This is, by the way, why we tell people to delete tracks you don't need before you create next year. Because if I had a bunch of other tracks up here on this display, when I ran create next year, it would give me a copy of each one of those. Because I only had 4 to start with, it only gave me 4 more copies. So that's the step that starts us all, create next year, and it does 2 things. It gave me those master boards to mess with, but for our purposes today, what we care about is it gave us our next year tracks. And that is the step that you do as a school person, not as a district person. You do that at each of your schools, even if you only have little kids and don't schedule them in the classes. 3-4 years ago, it was much more common than it is now because you guys have heard us harping on this for so long. It used to be that if you ran an elementary school, you didn't do the step I just did now. They just created the tracks by hand, manually. Unfortunately, you can create the tracks by manual method. We tell you not to do that because if you do create the tracks manually, if you don't do the step I just did, you will get error messages later, I guarantee it. And then I will get emails and I'll get phone calls. So remember, when you've been to other webinars, when I showed you this step, what was I always emphatic about when I did the other webinars? I preached that you cannot create next year tracks on your own. You must come in and do it the way I just showed you, allowing the system to create next year's tracks. Because to create them manually isn't just failing to follow a best practice, it's setting yourself up for guaranteed error messages down the road. And as I said, what happens then is I get emails and I get phone calls. Okay? So let's talk about the next step in this process. Let's get you back up here and let's say, okay, you've now used the system to create next year, and during that process you created those valid next year tracks. Now we're getting down to what I really wanted to discuss today, next year tracks, grades, and statuses. We know from our experience that if a certain series of events happens on this screen, you will end up with potentially tons of blank records after you do your demographic rollover this summer. And then I get emails and I get phone calls. My teammates and I want things to go smoothly for you. So they sent me out here with some notes to help you out. The first recommendation we've always made on this page is you should have your schools fill it out. Not a district person, but your schools. Now, I know and we know that this can create some challenges. What if a school that's sending its students on to another school this summer? Let's think about your middle school, right? Because your middle school is going to graduate 8th graders that are going to go to your high school. Well, what if that middle school has not yet filled out this form? Well, the high school people will neither be able to fill out this form themselves, nor will they have next year's 9th graders available to them in SchoolLogic. And when I say the high school wouldn't be able to fill out this form, what I mean is a high school operator should see next year's 9th graders on this form. The high school operator will not see next year's 9th graders on this form unless the middle school did its job first. So the plan is, step number 1, making your school people do this form, and step number 2, make sure your school people fill this out in order. And by order, I don't mean from left to right on the screen. We mean begin with your elementary schools and work upwards through your division or district, finishing with your high schools. This will allow the intake schools, middle schools take in kids from elementary, high schools take in kids from middle schools. Okay? This will allow your intake schools to populate the required next year fields for their incoming pre-registered students. Now let's think about this for a second. Let's say your elementary ends at grade 5. Your elementary operator gives her 5th grade students a NY, next year, school of the middle school. And once she submits this form, that's what makes the 5th graders available as potential 6th graders for the middle school or your middle schools. The same thing happens at the middle school. The middle school staff member declares this year's 8th graders are going to have a next year's school of the high school. And then she submits. And that submission makes it possible for the high school counselors to start planning on next year's 9th grade enrollment numbers. Now, by the way, this is one of the parts where we've observed if you do this out of order, you can end up with bogus records after rollover, just so you know. If populating next year's fields is not completed in the ascending order you see here, elementary's first, then middle schools and high schools, it is critical that these fields are reviewed and, where necessary, populated through global updates prior to running your year-end demographic rollover. So what I just said is, hey, if you don't do this in this order, okay. But if you don't do it in this order, it's really critical you review the data the kids end up with. Now, if this whole thing of schools working in order doesn't make a lot of sense to you logistically, let me suggest something like this. You give your elementaries a window of a certain number of days. Let's say they have until close of business on Wednesday to do their thing. Then the window opens for the middle school or schools. They get a certain number of days. And then the window closes for them and opens for the high school, something like that. It's important that you understand when I say window closes here, I'm speaking metaphorically. I'm not saying you're going to lock the data down. Now, every time this form opens, it appears blank. But just because it's blank doesn't mean it hasn't been run yet. If you're unsure, you don't know if somebody's used this form or not, well, okay, what do I do then? Well, if I was unsure, I'd go to student demographics, I'd look at my NYR fields, and I'd look at a cross-section of students. Don't just look at one kid. If you go to these students and you see data in their next year fields, well, then don't run the screen again. Now, how many days you allow, for your middle school, then your high school, and all that business, how many days you allow is basically a function of how many schools you are, how much time you have to work with. You folks in the schools can work out the details. Now, how many students? The number of students in each school doesn't really affect those windows of opportunities unless you have tons of tracks. But how many students do you have? I'm going to suggest 3. Wait. I don't mean that you only have 3 total students. I mean you have 3 types of students. 3 types. No, wait. Did I use my outside keyboard on that last slide? Okay. For the purposes of next year tracks, grades, and statuses, we care about these 3 types of students. Every student in your database is one of these 3 types. And that's how we're going to approach our choices on that next year tracks, grades, and statuses form. Let's first talk about returning students. Let me just go back here for a second. When I talk about 3 types of students, hey, the kid is either continuing in your school, he's returning to your school in the fall, or the kid is leaving your school but staying within your district or board. That's, those 5th graders leading the elementary, the 8th graders leading the middle school. Or the kid is leaving your district altogether, as is the case of a 12th grader graduating and moving on to bigger and better things. Let's talk first about the returning students, because the returning students are easily your largest group, right? Now, I've got 5 slots. If you remember that next year tracks, grades, and statuses screen, and that's okay if you don't remember it in your head, because I'll show it to you again in a minute. I've got 5 slots per track on that form. Returning students are going to get something filled in to 4 of those 5 slots. And these are the 4 right here. NYR in status. What that means is, how is the kid starting next year? Well, if he's continuing within your building, you know what that is. It's usually like continuous registration or whatever. But the main point is that you as a building operator know what status you want that kid to have for next year. NYR grade, NYR track mean what you think. Next year's grade, next year's track. They're staying in your building. You know the answers to that. And the bottom one is obvious. The bottom one, next year's school, if they're returning to you, obviously their next year's school equals their current school. So here's my elementary. Now, let's continue to look at those returning or continuing students. For instance, a 2nd grader, right? He's going to come into 3rd grade next year. He's going to still be with me. I said he gets 4 pieces of information. He gets a continuing registration because that's his in status for next fall. The 2nd grader gets an NYR grade level of 3rd. His next year grade level is 3rd. You give him the appropriate track for next year because we already created those, right? And then he's coming back to your elementary for next year. Every grade except the one in the middle on this chart is returning to me. That's why every grade except 5th grade has 4 areas filled in. Those are 4 areas I spoke of. Each and every one of those kids gets an in status. He gets a grade level, he gets a track, he gets a school. Notice it is only the students who are leaving me who are filled out differently. Now, let's talk about those differences. This is the 2nd largest group of kids that you deal with. Students who are leaving your school but are staying within your district. They're the 2nd largest group of kids. They are the trickiest kids to discuss. This group is where we have definitely come up with some best practices ideas. There are 5 pieces of information. but they are not all going to get filled out by the same staff members. In fact, we would suggest they don't get filled out by the same school. Now let's talk a little bit about each of them. Remember, we're going to be in elementary school, right? We're talking about 5th graders who are leaving an elementary, or we're talking about 8th graders leaving that middle school. NYRN status. We would suggest that that gets filled in by the intake school, next year's school. Because I'm an elementary operator, I don't know what in status the middle school operator wants. I'm going to leave that alone. NYR out status. We're going to suggest that the elementary school, the outgoing school, fills that in, the current school, if you will. What's the NYR out status? That's the status the kid has to end this year. Well, if he's ending this year at my school, I am in a position to know what that status should be. I should fill it in. NYR grade. We can go either way on that. Either the current school or next year's school can fill that in. NYR track pretty much has to be filled in by next year's school because I'm the elementary operator and I don't have access to the middle school tracks. And the middle school operator doesn't have access to the high school tracks. So NYR track should be filled in by the intake school. And then the last one, the NYR school, what school is the kid going to go to next year? As the outgoing school, I have to fill that in. I'm the one that controls when my 5th graders become pre-registered 6th graders. I control when my 8th graders become pre-registered 9th graders. So this last one is really important. The act of me assigning an NYR school to my departing students is the act which makes those students available to the next school. If I'm an elementary secretary, I look at my 5th graders who are going to be 6th graders next year, and I assign them to an NYR school, which is one of my middle schools. Now, it's obviously the easiest if your district or board only has one middle school, but I'm going to cover that too. It is only after I do that that the middle school staff has those students available to them. This is what makes them pre-registered in middle school. Now, even though this is the only group of students for which we advocate you fill in all 5 pieces of information, your outgoing school doesn't really have that much work to do. They set the student up with an explanation of how they left their present school this spring. That's this guy. And then they tell the system which school this group of kids is going to be in next year, NYR school. We advocate you have the intake school do the rest. So that's how my elementary school looks on paper, and this is how my elementary school looks in the real world. Now let's talk first about those 5th graders who are moving up to 6th grade. We said the outgoing school fills in the reason for them leaving this spring. That's out status. We see it here. Graduated to OMS. That's the middle school in this operation. So we we give them a school for next year. And right here you see it says SL Middle. So we're shipping them to the middle school. Well, fine and good. The elementary can now submit this because they've got all their continuing kids already filled in too. You can now click submit. The elementary gets their work done within the allotted days, and that makes these 5th graders available to the middle school. Now, if you're sitting really, really close to your monitor and you notice that my elementary operator did fill in the grade level for next year, hey, don't worry about that. In and of itself, that's not a problem. But you can't expect the elementary operator to fill in the next year track because she doesn't have access to the middle school tracks. If she fills in the grades, so be it. In some districts, she'll be able to see that 6th grade. In other district setups, that won't even be available to her. Now, let me digress for a moment, because I mentioned a minute ago I'd answer this next question, because this is a question we sometimes get on the help desk. Well, what if there's 2 middle schools, right? I'm an elementary secretary, and my 5th graders are going to actually go to 2 different schools next year. They're not all going to the same school. Okay. Some of the students from this elementary are going to go to Prentice Middle School, while other fifth graders from this school will end up in Obama Middle School. How would I set that up? Well, my answer, because I'm not really that smart and I'm lazy, is figure out which school is going to get the majority of your students. 51% is all it takes. If 51% of my students are going to Prentice, I would make Prentice my next year's school. Now, briefly, what that does is that makes them all pre-registered at Prentice as soon as I submit it. Now, don't go crazy about that. As soon as I was done with this, I would then go out of this form, I would go to Global Assign, and I would assign the Obama students to their next year's school. It's going to have Prentice filled in for them, but you're going to assign them to Obama using Global Assign. All of the students will have been forwarded, they would have been forwarded to the first school, to Prentice, but I'm going to select the kids designated for Obama. I'm going to use Global Assign to make that move. And I make that move within my window, right? We said the middle school gets X number of days to do their business. I would do that right away as soon as I submitted my kids. Then I wouldn't forget about it, and then they would show up as pre-registered at the proper building. Now, if you tuned me out for that last paragraph, if you said to yourself, hey, you know what? We only have one middle school. I don't have to listen to what Al's got to say. Okay, great, beautiful. I want you to tune in for this next nugget. I'm the middle school operator. This is my student who is currently in my 8th grade, right? It says 8th grade up here. But I've already submitted the next year tracks, grades, and statuses page. Notice that when I now come into his personal next year demographics page, I cannot edit it. You and I are all used to seeing the word edit down here where this maroon circle is. It's not there. That's because once I assign an NYR school that is something other than mine and I submit, the student's NYR fields no longer belong to me. I still own the kid. I'm going to do everything else for the kid, the grading, attendance, all that stuff for the completion of this year, right? But once I assign my departing student to his next school, I cannot edit inside this circle. I'm not going to see edit. I don't get to edit this particular screen of information about the kid. I still get to edit everything else about the kid. Now on this screen, I'm logged in as the high school operator. Notice that edit has returned. Same kid. Okay? Once the middle school made my school the NYR school and submitted that choice, me, the high school operator, was granted control of those kids' NYR fields. So that's kind of cool. It's almost like the computer knows what it's doing. However, check this out. The middle school operator can still use Global Assign, that's what this is, for those outgoing students. Global Assign would still work for her. She can no longer edit the next year fields for her 8th graders one at a time. But she can come in here and use Global Assign to edit any of the NYR fields. Now, when might she need to do that? Well, like I said in my example, if her outgoing students are not all going to the same school, she might come in here and mess with this. Let's return to the middle school. I'm the middle school operator. The first thing I can tell by looking at this is that my elementary operators have done what they're supposed to do. Remember, this grade level at far left is always the grade level the kid is in this year. And here we see this year's 5th graders. I'm a middle school operator. I have middle schoolers in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade running around in my halls right now. But these 5th graders are not yet physically in my building. But because the elementary operator did what she was supposed to within her allotted window of time, I now have access to them, and they show up here on this screen as pre-registered. Way cool. Let's look at them first. We said that when kids move within the district, the outgoing school only has to choose their NYR out status, okay? They didn't pick that. Actually, they did, and it's already been submitted. That's why it's blank here, okay? I don't get to pick the kids' NYR out status. I don't get to say how are they leaving this year because I'm the middle school operator and they are not attending my place this year, okay? And then we said they're going to fill in, what's the outgoing operator going to fill in? They're going to fill in the middle school for next year. That's really all that they were going to fill in. If a kid is leaving your school, you say, how is he leaving my building this year? You say, where is he going? And the rest of these choices, as a middle school operator, I have to fill in, okay? Because I know what in status I want them to have for next fall. By the way, it's enrolled from OES, which means enrolled from my elementary. I'm going to give them a grade level of 6 for next year. They're currently in 5th grade. That makes sense. And as the middle school operator, I know which NYR track I want them to be in next year. I want them to be in my NYR track of 6th grade, okay? As a middle school operator, I'd fill in what you see here. I'd fill in the in status. I'd fill in the grade level. I'd fill in the track. One row above the current 5th graders are my current 8th graders. I treat them just like the elementary treated those 5th graders. I only give them an out status for this year. How are they leaving me? And I give them a high school because that's where they're going next year. I can fill in the grade level or not as I choose. Doesn't really matter. The only fields we recommend that you assign to students leaving your school but staying within your district are the out status and the school they're going to attend next year. Okay, it's not going to hurt anything if you fill in the grade. Now, depending upon how things are set up in your world, you might not be able to assign another school's grade, and you definitely won't be able to assign another school's track. And now we go to the high school, just for a second, to see what the high school will do with those 8th graders. Because remember, I said on the far left, I said the grade level you see is always this year's grade level. Here are the current 8th graders, and they show up as pre-registered in my high school. Why? Because the middle school operator did what she was supposed to within the allotted time, which was she gave them an NYR school, a high school, and that's what makes them show up here as pre-registered. It's pretty cool when it works. The process works. You just got to work the process. Now, you see out status is empty, okay? Because the outgoing school handles out status, and they also handle the NYR school, although you see on this screenshot I filled in the NYR school again. The reason the out status for the 8th graders is empty here is because the middle school filled it in and submitted it. And remember, that out status applies to this year, and this year I don't really own the 8th graders, okay? Middle school handles that. Notice on the student's track, here on the far left, I'm sorry, comes up as pre-registered. The middle school didn't have access to this year's tracks. That's why they haven't been assigned, okay? It didn't have access to high school tracks. Now, as a high school person, I have to fill in 3 of the 5. I fill in the NYR in status. What status do I want the kid to have coming into my building next fall? That makes sense. I'm going to own them in the fall. I fill in their grade level for the fall. I fill in their track for the fall because I'm the high school operator. The middle school operator did not have access to my tracks. That's why tracks makes total sense. So for the incoming 8th graders, I get 60% of their data gets filled in by me at the high school. Which brings us to our third and final group of students, my smallest group, those kids who are sadly, or in some cases, you're happy, those kids are leaving your school and they're leaving your district or your board. I'm the high school operator, and kids who currently are 12th graders this year, they're going somewhere next year. They're leaving my school. That's kind of all I care about. So the only thing that I need to fill in is their NYR out status. I give them graduated or whatever it is I give them, and I tell them not to let the door hit them in the fanny as they leave. So my high school looks like this. Here's those graduating 12th graders. It says graduated from OHS. OHS is my high school. Notice that's the only piece of information I fill in for them. My continuing students, I fill in the stuff that makes sense, right? What in status do I want for them in next fall? Kids who are currently 9th graders are going to be 10th graders next fall. 10th graders are going to be 11th graders. You get it, okay? Simple choices for the continuing students. The 12th graders who are leaving the whole shoot and match or leaving the district or the board, I just graduate them and I tell them have a nice day. And then my 8th graders, those are the kids coming up from middle school. I fill in 60% of their stuff and I have a nice day. Now just a reminder, in SERS, I get to that equivalent screen. I go to the setup menu, I choose next year, and then I choose next year tracks, grades, and statuses. The SERS operators have most of the same choices, except they don't have that choice of school. And that's the nitty and gritty of our suggestions for best practices to fill out this form in SchoolLogic. Now, those of you who have attended my webinars before, as you might expect, I have some other thoughts as well. Unless this entire page is repopulated with the correct information, run this page only once per school. Running the process a second time, like let's say you've made changes, if you run it the second time with only the changes entered, still submits the entire page, not just the changes. So manual changes you made in between times just got overwritten. Valid information those kids had out there just got overwritten. Okay? Submit this page once per school, unless you totally fill out the whole page. Here's another best practice. Resist the temptation to slip next year fields onto your students' regular demographics pages. This is an option SchoolLogic users get. SERS users don't get this choice. The reason SchoolLogic users are able to do something like this is because SchoolLogic users, unlike SERS, get to design each of their students' demographic cards, controlling where each piece of information gets placed. Okay? You get to do that in SchoolLogic. You don't get to do that in SERS. I'm telling you, in SchoolLogic, don't put NYR fields any place other than here. You go to the student menu, you pick demographics next to your fields, and you end up on this form right here. Keep your NYR tracks, grades, and statuses on the form we gave you on the student menu. They're all there in one place. It's very convenient for you. It frees up screen real estate on your other forms, so you can choose to put other bits of information in there. Most importantly, this is just a zoomed-in version of that screen. Okay, I went to the student menu. Here's what I did. I went to the student menu and I picked demographic next to your fields, and this is where I ended up, right? Now, like all other student demographic fields, I am required to inform you that if a piece of information appears on two different student forms, I cannot guarantee that if you update one of the fields, both of them will get edited. So that's really the main reason. It's not about screen real estate. It's about the fact that if you put one of these fields somewhere else and you update that field, let's say NYR track, in the other location, there's no guarantee that it's going to get changed on this display, and vice versa. NYR fields are like any other piece of demographic information. If a piece of information is stored on more than one card, I can't guarantee they'll both get updated. Now, after you have your schools go through all this process, right? Al talked about windows of opportunity and blah, blah, blah. We recommend that after the process is complete, each school confirms the accuracy of student NYR fields. We suggest that you do this after all of the schools have completed submitting NYR fields. We suggest you do this one more time, probably early this summer, just prior to running the year-end demographic rollover. Correct entry of next year fields is critical to a successful demographic rollover. In fact, that's the major reason I called you guys around here today. So, how do you do this verification? Well, you can go to the screen I showed you last, where you go to the student menu and you pick students next year, tracks, grades, and statuses. You can review a cross-section of all grades, both students that are remaining with you and those transferring out. You want to look at many samples to ensure that all the required NYR fields are correctly populated. Now remember, I'm not that smart, but I'm lazy. Do I really want to go look at a cross-section of kids? Another method, which is less intensive, is create a user-defined report which shows the pieces of information that are important to you. You could do this in either SIRS or SchoolLogic. Now remember, probably 30 minutes ago, I told you the document that this webinar is built around is posted on our website. It's called Next Year Creation SL. Page 6 of this document literally shows you how to create the user-defined report. Page 6 and page 7 go on to show you how you can export data from that report into Excel. And then you can really filter it and sort the information in Excel and see if you have the right stuff in the right place. My teammate Julie Clifford is an Excel fiend. She made this document. She's really terrific with it. On the bottom of page 6 on that document, and then you go into page 7, Julie takes you into Excel. She really gets after it. It's way cool. Okay, everybody take a breath. Those were the best practices which we've refined over the past couple years, and I wanted to show them to you because I want your scheduling to go smoothly this spring, and I want your rollover to go really smoothly this summer. Let's review, because what do we do in education? We review, and then I'll let you guys go. What did we do today? We created next year, which creates the tracks, right? We created next year. That action creates the tracks. Remember what Al said. Al said don't ever create tracks manually. You always want the software to be doing the process. Al said if I'm a hybrid school, I should create next year in SchoolLogic. Even though I know good and well in my head that I'm going to schedule in SIRS, create next year in SchoolLogic, because otherwise SchoolLogic will squawk at you later. And then that action, by the way, also creates those master boards that you're going to schedule in. We went to that next year tracks, grades, and statuses screen, spent a ton of time there. What did we talk about? A, each school fills out their own. We do this at a school level, not at a district or a board level. Start with the elementaries. Work toward the high schools. For continuing kids, meaning kids who are continuing in my building or my school, fill in the in status, fill in their grade, fill in their track, fill in their school. Kids who are continuing, fill in 4 pieces of information. Kids who are leaving my building but staying within the district, just give them an out status and an NYR school. All you're going to say is, what's the status that they're going to leave with my building this spring, and what school are they going to next fall? And then the intake school, the school they are going to, handles their NYR in status. What status do they have to start next fall? Their grade for next year and their track for next year. Then you got that small group of kids, right? The kids who are leaving your district or your board. All you give them is an out status, give them a little diploma, wave at them. Keep your next year data on the one page. Remember I said, if you store the same piece of data in 2 different places in SchoolLogic, there's no guarantee that they will both get updated when you update one. And then I said, verify, verify, verify. Hey, today's January 22nd. I am going to guess that some of you have already been here, done this. I just want to say, no worries. Okay, there are schools that I'm talking to right now. I got 27 people in this meeting. Some of you have already completed next year tracks, grades, and statuses. That's okay. We are not telling you to go back and do everything again. You folks, we want you folks to do 2 things. A, we want you to be especially vigilant about verifying your data. I really do recommend that you go to the community pages, you download Julie's little next year documents. It's about 8 pages, not a huge document. Follow the directions for the user-defined report. Export the data into Excel if you like, and make sure your kids have the information they need. You look at the charts on this PowerPoint, or you can look at the same piece of information in Julie's PDF and see which group of my 3 groups does the student fall into, and therefore, which pieces of information should the student have. Check that now, and then check it again in June or July just before you do your rollover. Okay, and by the way, you have to do the export again, okay? Can't just go in and look at Excel a second time. Do the export again, too, because information may have changed. Sometimes the information changes on purpose. Sometimes the information changes because somebody's fingers are where they maybe shouldn't be. The other thing I want you to do is I want you to follow these directions next year, okay? If you've already done this for this year, don't go back and change everything, but follow my directions next year and see if it works for you. Now, final thought. If you are from Alberta or Illinois, you may have heard that all students need an exit code every year, or you may have heard that all students need both an exit code and an entry code every year. Let me explain why those conditions do not apply to what you heard so far today. Let's take Alberta first. Beginning next year, Alberta will be requiring a new line for each year. When I say a new line, I am thinking of the status table, right? The status tab. Each kid is going to get a new line for every year. Not this year, next year. As you know, SchoolLogic is testing a PASI-compliant version. That version already has the new in and out fields for Alberta students. Those are separate fields from where you saw me working today. Those fields will not change what we, by we I mean you, do this spring. Okay? We don't have to worry about that yet. Illinois has a year-end status, which is also a separate field. It gets filled in for state-level government reporting. It is not part of that status tab, a separate field from where you saw me working today. So there you have it. We've got some good materials waiting for you at the address you see here, community.schoollogic.com. There's a PDF explaining what I just showed you, one for SERS users, one for SchoolLogic users. By the close of business tomorrow, I hope, there will also be up at community.schoollogic.com a recording of this webinar. Hey, both at work and at play, try to stay out of the ditches. I wish you smooth trails ahead. Thank you so much for attending today. Thank you very much.